there is going to be a swarm of an insect here on the East Coast starting this year and going into 2021. It's going to go all the way up the East Coast. And this is something that scientists have been talking about for a while. It puzzles scientists, but they know about it.
We are awash with humanitarian challenges around the world at the moment. You all cover them very fully. I'm grateful for that. And one of the things we're seeing is when we have a new problem that we think is really, really challenging, it's really difficult to get enough attention to it because there's so much else going on. And that's why I just wanted myself to come and offer you a few comments really about this locust threat we see in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. We think, and again Keith and Dominique can say more about this, that one of the reasons we have this problem now to a greater degree than we've seen, I mean, this is the worst for 70 years in Kenya, for 25 years in Ethiopia and Somalia. One of the reasons we have this problem now is climatic. So this is another dimension of the climate emergency. $76 million in the great scheme of things is not a huge amount of money.
It's one of those days today in North Carolina where the wind chill is just brr. I don't know. It's really not that cold just standing out in the open, but the wind, man, it's like bone chilling, especially down here in the south where we've got, you know, quite a bit of humidity. When it's cold, you just feel it more. I don't know why. When we were up in Colorado, I was outside filming some bison, and it was in the teens. Granted, it wasn't windy, but I was just standing out there filming with a vest on and a long sleeve shirt, nothing special, not too, I think it, just like a kind of a denim shirt, and I was perfectly fine. But then, we come here and it's like, upper 30s, low 40s with a breeze, and for whatever reason it just feels bone chilling to me. Anyway, I was going to talk to you guys about this locust situation. Z has sent 100,000 ducks to the Pakistan border to combat the locusts.
Experts in China say it's less likely the swarms move all the way to China now, but have raised the possibility that the country could be hit by a wave of the insects if the outbreak isn't brought under control by this summer.
The problem is that when China says that they're going to send 100,000 ducks somewhere, you have to realize 50,000 of those are probably going to end up missing before they ever get to the border. And then the ones that are on the border, over half of them are probably going to be slaughtered for food and other things. So, the impact that these ducks are going to have, I don't know. And I think I think it was more or less just a political move. I don't even know if I can believe the reports. We've only seen that one report with a couple images of the ducks going to the border, and he's been hailed for his environmental efforts of handling the locust program or locust problem naturally. It's kind of funny.
Meanwhile, the United Nations chief said there is a link between climate change and the unprecedented locust crisis plaguing East Africa.
When you read up about the locusts and you type in a Google search, it amazes me, absolutely amazes me. It's profound how many articles there are from, what some people would consider reputable news sources that talk about the locust plague being caused by climate change.
The United Nations says locust swarms are threatening the food supply of millions. They've devastated thousands of crops as they move across parts of Africa. Climate change might play a role.
And it makes you wonder, do people not understand history enough to actually go back and do some research on locust breakouts? I mean, what we're seeing right now is a high amount of locusts, but it's not unusual. It's not the highest we've ever seen. It's definitely not. It's biblical in proportion, yes, but it's not anything super unusual.
100 to 200 billion locusts, 240 kilometres squared. Oh, 2,400. So 10 times the size of what I said, 2,400. When I started to look at these numbers, it took me a while to get my head around them, but the more I thought about it, the more seized I was.
I've done some research on, the largest locust breakouts where they have migrating swarms, and I did find a pattern.
And I don't think you need to be a rocket science to put two and two together.
Just pick up a history book or do a quick Google search on the history of locusts. It has nothing to do with climate change. In fact, the locust breakouts are quite the opposite of global warming. But anyway, I'm going to talk about this and explain to you a little bit of the history of the locust to help you out a little bit. The other thing that I've had a lot of people ask me about from my last locust video is, can we expect a breakout in the U.S.? And so I'm going to get into a little bit of the history of the U.S. with locust problems and what the possibilities are of another possible outbreak.
Global commitment is needed also to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, including by the big emitters. It's essential that the developed world reduces its emissions. It's essential that other big emitters reduce their emissions. And it's essential that the developed world strongly supports Africa in adaptation, in building resilience, and in the financial requirements that Africa needs to face climate change. Africa has done the least to cause this emergency, yet suffers some of the most devastating consequences. To address those consequences, I continue to press for greater international support for financing, adaptation and resilience across the continent.
My wife is trying to build a rock wall, so I've got all these rocks to move. This particular pile of rocks came from the Carolina terrain. No. These came from the Jurassic terrain part, that's real close to where we live. In the Jurassic terrain is where they're all trying to do all their fracking and everything. I hope they don't end up fracking, but you never know. So anyway, going back to the locust plagues, I went back, quite a ways. I wanted to collect data that I could directly correlate with other data. So, I didn't look into ancient times, I didn't look into biblical history, because we know that there have been locust plagues throughout history. It's just, part of nature. In terms of locust breakouts in recent history, the 74 to 75 locust plague in North America trumps anything we've ever seen. We're talking like right now in Africa, around 360 billion locusts. Okay, what happened in North America was a couple trillion locusts. There were so many locusts, the swarm was the size of California.
We were taking supper with a family we love so dearly. Suddenly, I saw the mother's face grow blank. She pointed to the northwest. As we all looked, we saw an immense cloud rising swiftly. Then we heard a roar and a rush. Grasshoppers, inconceivable millions of them. They instantly filled the air. Though the cloud itself passed slowly onward, the ground already was spread thickly with those living creatures, all eating. Instantly, they began to devour everything green except the buffalo grass.
Back then in the U.S., what farmers tried to do is they tried to build fires around their farmland. But the locust swarms were so big that they just fly into the fires and end up putting the fire out. There was a New York Times reporter that wrote about the locust swarms coming into cornfields, and within 3 hours, it looked like somebody had completely just mowed down the field and removed all the corn. All the stalks were taken all the way down to the ground by these locusts. These plagues were so bad, people were having, problems with them flying into their house. they couldn't get outdoors. I mean, that was one of the most serious locust plagues that we know about in recent history, and that happened in the 1800s, the late 1800s and the 1870s, around the same time frame that periodic plagues were breaking out in Australia. But the 74-75 plague in North America was absolutely horrible. Families actually starved to death during that plague because back then, we didn't have the same type of resources we have now. They didn't have food, they died.
In no time at all, up and down the valley, those honest, brave, patient, hard-working men, women, and children were hungry, hopelessly hungry. Families that had been dragging along on a tiny ration of boiled wheat reached the end of that supply.
From pure starvation. I mean, there are news articles talking about the people starving in North America during that time frame. So something that I find interesting between 1844, which we saw a major locust outbreak in Australia, and then in the 1870s, specifically 74, 75, that time frame where this massive plague broke out in North America. In North America, that was called the Rocky Mountain locust, which has been since extinct. But I'm going to get into a little bit more about what we can expect in North America later in the video. But then in Australia, you also had those breakouts during the 1870s. So what is a correlation there that I noticed is that 1844, you were during the minimum period of solar activity, and then in 1874, 1875, that time frame, again, you were in a minimum period of solar activity. And not only were these periods of minimum solar activity, but they were prolonged periods of very low solar minimum activity compared to what we've seen in recent years in modern history. And I think that that's one of the things that throws people off. When I go through these different plagues and I explain them to you, we'll start to see some patterns form, but we're also going to start to see where, maybe the plagues died off for a period of time. Maybe we didn't see these massive plagues up until the 2000s, and that's where this climate change, global warming theory comes in as, oh, the plagues are back, it must be climate change. But I'm going to show you how this transition, this progress actually plays out, and maybe you'll see a different correlation. During that North American plague, they said that there were so many locusts, trillions and trillions of locusts. When you walk outside, all you could hear was little jaws chomping on fresh vegetation.
The pigs and the chickens, brought hopefully across hundreds of miles for fine breeding stock, had to die too. Men looked at each other in the face and grew pale. They could have fought bands of Cheyenne or Sioux, but these small insects, they could not fight.
1870s and early 1900s, jump up to 1915. We're talking solar minimum period of the 15th solar minimum. And what did we see? We saw a major upsurge in Syria, one that was one for the history books. Go through solar cycle 15, no big deal. You get into solar cycle 16, 17 minimum period, and you hit another outbreak of locusts here in the US with the High Plains locusts. And that outbreak was pretty severe as well. It was one for the history books. And the High Plains locust wasn't the only locust to break out during that minimum period. We actually had another breakout during that period of another North American locust, and that was called the Carolina locust. And that breakout happened between 33 and 34, I think, still during the minimum cycling of, solar cycle 16 and 17. So, something that we're starting to see here from the 1840s to 1870s to, the 1900s is that these major widespread locust breakouts appear to be happening during periods of minimum solar activity. But, you know, from the 1930s and 20s on, we didn't necessarily see epic breakouts anywhere. There was, you know, somewhat of a breakout in the 1960s, 1966 to 69, which was a solar maximum period. But that breakout was rather small in comparison. We're talking, you know, I think that the locust grew to like 30 million. It made it into the books as a plague, but that's because they covered a small area of land, so it was very localized. And that localized breakout is nothing compared to what we're talking about when we're talking about locust plagues. We're talking about widespread damage to crops. And I think that this locust plague we're seeing in Africa is just still getting going. And that one could easily grow. I mean, the ones that grew in the United States, I mean, those weren't one-year events. Those were multi-year events that happened, you know, between 1934 to 1935. There was the big one was between 1874, 1875, settled down in 1876. So these plagues are multi-year events. They're not something that just break out and die down, and the locusts repopulate and get worse and worse. Now the 03, 04, 05, so that event started in 03 and really picked up going into 04, 05. You know, the deepest part of that cycle was probably around 2007, 2008, but it was definitely during a period in the cycle when we were going down in solar activity. We were below maximum levels for solar activity. And so there's definitely, it doesn't take a genius to look at all these dates and look at all these breakouts, put two and two together and say, oh, well, the locust breakouts seem to be coordinating with minimal solar activity.
And I don't think you need to be a rocket science to put two and two together.
Well, why is that? That's because they correlate with damper weather, wetter weather. They need that wetter weather to break out.
And the kind of weather patterns we've seen are have been providing more pasture, if I've got that, I think I've got that right, for the locust to feed off and breed and create this threat. And
repopulate as quickly as they do. And we don't necessarily see that during maximum periods. It tends to be a little drier. And somebody on our channel said the other day, well, global warming, CO2 is putting more, what did they say? They said because of CO2, there's more water vapor in the air. And CO2 creates clouds that cause it to rain. And this person clearly didn't even understand the dynamics of what it was in the science that they were talking about. But CO2 is a greenhouse gas, does cause a warming effect, but it's logarithmic, which means that the higher concentrations of CO2 have less of an impact on the environment than as it started to build up. So if you had 100 parts per million and it raised it a degree of temperature, and you went to 200 parts per million, it would raise it 2 degrees, right? But then if you went to 300 parts per million, it would only go up 1.5 degrees, because the parts per million would have to keep doubling. The amount of CO2 would have to keep doubling before it has an impact. So if you're at 500 parts per million, and each interval is a degree, then the next increase would be at 1,000 parts per million. And then we get to 2,000 parts per million. So it gets harder and harder for CO2 to actually have an impact on temperature in the environment. Now, water vapor is something different. That has more of a direct correlation to heating and cooling. And as we know, in warmer environments where in times where there's a lot of solar activity, we have a lot of evaporation. That water goes up into the atmosphere and it stays up there. You could argue that CO2 warming, helped heat the planet enough to evaporate water, but we also know from very elementary school level science that the sun causes evaporation. So we have a lot of evaporation, we have a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere, and then when you go into a period of minimal solar activity, what actually happens to our planet is it has an influx of cosmic rays, and those cosmic rays play a very significant role with the overall locust population problem, because cosmic rays cause cloud seeding. Cloud seeding causes clouds to grow and condensate that moisture in the atmosphere, and then you have localized downpours of rain.
Well, the cloud experiment is this large chamber behind me. And what we're trying to do with the cloud experiment is we're trying to understand what the connection is between a cosmic ray going through the atmosphere and the creation of so-called aerosol seed, the seed for a cloud droplet or an ice particle. And to do that, we've made a very, very clean, large 3-meter chamber here, made of stainless steel. In it, we put a selected trace gases and very pure air, humidified. And that represents a parcel of air that we've selected somewhere in the atmosphere. And we expose it to a beam from the CERN proton synchrotron as an artificial adjustable source of cosmic rays. And we see the effect of the CERN beam on the creation of these seeds inside the chamber.
Now, the other interesting attribute to cosmic rays is if you look at certain things like viral breakouts, the Spanish flu, African swine fever, SARS, the current virus, what happens is during these periods of cosmic ray activity, increased cosmic rays, cells are able to change and metamorphosize faster and easier. The locust is a grasshopper that has gone through a cycling, a metamorphosis, to come out on the other end as what we call the locust. It's actually a different, it's the same grasshopper, same species, but it looks different. It's bigger, it's got bigger muscles, it behaves differently. And so one of the things that you can observe from this is that that tends to happen more easily and more frequently during solar minimum periods. And if what we know about cosmic rays and their effects on cells is accurate, then that would, help explain why these outbreaks seem to be more prominent during those periods of time. More moisture, higher cosmic rays. Those are those are two things that are feeding these bug breakouts. There's definitely no correlation to global warming and the locust breakouts, other than that part of the global warming narrative nowadays is that it causes more moisture. If you go back 10 years, global warming caused more droughts and dry temperatures and heat and desertification. Now they're saying that it causes more moisture. The narrative doesn't make any sense, and I would encourage people to actually do some observational research yourself, because there is a correlation between locust breakouts and solar cycles, and that the science behind what happens throughout different solar cycles could help explain some of the reasons for those locust breakouts. I mean, there's got to be 100 reasons to one that cause locusts to swarm, but the main thing is that it creates the perfect breeding ground, and they're able to go through that metamorphosis into the locust. And those are two things that we find to be heavily apparent with solar minimum periods. Now, if we go into a grand solar minimum, as some scientists are predicting, including some scientists at NASA, if we go into a grand solar minimum, would these plagues continue to thrive and grow? More than likely, I would say so, because it correlates with the perfect conditions for it. And so I think if that happened, you could start to see locust breakouts similar to what we saw over 100 years ago, which were massive in scale. Like, we're talking 5 or 6 times bigger than what we're seeing in Africa. And that is, in my opinion, a scary thought. Now, when it comes to North America, I said the Rocky Mountain locust was extinct. The high mid-plains locust is what they call endangered, and I would argue that if you talk to somebody in Africa about an endangered locust, they would laugh at you and say, do you have any idea how fast that thing can repopulate? And then we have the Carolina locust, which is actually a very widespread grasshopper across the United States. But a locust is just a modified grasshopper. So that's not to say that one of these other grasshopper species, which we have all over the United States, could not develop into a locust swarm. And that's something to remember when you're looking at this stuff. It is not scientifically impossible for any type of grasshopper to develop into a locust swarm. It just requires the right breeding conditions, etc. So we actually, you know, when we hear people say that swarm couldn't break out in North America, it more than likely could. The biggest issue that they're going to have is that you'll notice that a lot of these swarms start in very remote, unpopulated areas. So for a swarm to start here, it would really have to start in an area where there isn't a lot of population, where there isn't somebody using a lot of pesticides to control, and that swarm would then have to grow to about the size that it is in Africa now before people tried to start getting control over it. And I think that there are areas between, you know, the lower 48 states and Canada where a swarm could possibly break out, but it's not as conducive as an environment because of mankind for the locust. And so in that respect, I guess you could say that mankind is prohibiting the locust instead of causing it through climate change. There is going to be a swarm of an insect here on the East Coast starting this year and going into 2021. It's going to go all the way up the East Coast. And this is something that scientists have been talking about for a while. It puzzles scientists, but they know about it. And that is the cicada. We're going into the 17 brood of the cicada, which is the cicadas that come out every 17 years. They're going to be coming out in North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania in 2020, and then they're going to spread all the way up the East Coast going into 2021, and those are cicadas come out of the ground. These cicadas, this particular brood, there's multiple broods. This particular brood comes out every 17 years. It's one of the larger broods, so you're going to see like millions of these things swarming the East Coast. They don't eat crops though. What they'll do is they'll put their eggs into tree limbs. If you have some weaker trees, it might damage the tree, but for a healthy tree, it's perfectly fine. It's not going to hurt them. But they drink more than they eat. Cicadas do. So the cicada population this year is supposed to be extremely robust. It's going to feel like a plague on the East Coast, but it's not a plague because they're not going to be eating crops. They're not going to be eating you out of house and home. It's just going to feel a little icky when you go outside and you've got all these hundreds and thousands of cicadas flying around. The cicadas do sound pretty. The male cicadas come out and they kind of swarm in groups and make pretty noises and sing, and then they attract the females. So it's kind of an exciting thing to watch, especially when you have these 17-year events where they just come out in massive swarms. I remember in St. Louis back in 1998, some of the massive swarms that were out there were fantastic. So there is going to be some sort of swarm outbreak here in the United States this year. It's just not the grasshopper. But that's not to say that the locust could not come back in the States. The locust outbreaks, they do require kind of an uninhabited area to really start to develop that big of a swarm right away. But we have seen, as recent as the 30s, in the United States, locust outbreaks, and they're still here. The species are still here. The Rocky Mountain locust might be well and gone from mining in Colorado, but the High Plains locust and again the Carolina locust. The Carolina locust is everywhere in the lower 48. It's up in Canada, and if those hit the perfect conditions and are able to swarm, once they start swarming, it changes the entire makeup of the animal. That's when it becomes the locust. Otherwise, you're just looking at grasshoppers. So there is potential, and I think that when we've had 2 seasons, 2 years of wetness, that's what we haven't, nobody's sitting around measuring how many grasshoppers there are in the population. Nobody's been paying attention to that. How many grasshoppers were affecting crops last year, we don't know. But what we do know is that if those grasshoppers continue to breed and then they come back this year and there's more of them, that's when you can start hitting swarm potential. So these colder, wet, damp springs are definitely contributing factors to growing locust populations. I think the breakout would have to occur in an area that's not heavily populated and go unnoticed before it became a big problem in North America, which is why we're not as prone to them. But you could also have a locust outbreak in South America that comes up through, the peninsulas and comes into the United States that way. The Carolina locust is everywhere in North America, I think, except for Florida. But that's not to say that Florida doesn't have grasshoppers. Again, you could see any grasshopper breed and eventually turn into a locust. It's kind of interesting to know that mankind isn't actually causing the locust breakouts, and anything, we're prohibiting them. They've happened for thousands and thousands of years, and massive swarms bigger than what we've ever seen now. You read about them in the Bible all the time, and as like I said, as far away as 1874, trillions of locusts here in the United States. It kind of makes what's going on in Africa look very small, but what's happening in Africa is the biggest that we have seen since that time frame, and so that is why it is such a big deal. We don't realize how much food these locusts actually eat, but now with the population the size that it is, there is no telling how badly it's going to affect the overall food supply. In my perspective, if they make it through Pakistan and into China, China's already in a bad spot when it comes to livestock and everything else. A locust outbreak would just be horrific for them. I mean, that would just that would cause some serious damage.